This week's Torah portion takes us into a world of growing dispute and polarization. In the heat of the desert, banned from entering the land until one entire generation is replaced by the next, the Israelites mount a rebellion against Moses and Aaron's leadership. Led by the eponymous Korach, alongside 250 angry chieftains, the rebellion is quashed only through a series of mystical acts, the first of which is the mouth of the earth opening up to swallow up the rebels whole, tents and all. Famously, Korach's mutiny becomes a sort of an archetype of a kind of illegitimate argument in Jewish thought. The sages write, "An argument for the sake of heaven can endure, but an argument not for the sake of heaven will not endure. Which is an argument for the sake of heaven? They say the arguments of Hillel and Shammai. And which is an argument not for the sake of heaven? The argument of Korach and his company." Hillel and Shammai are found in the pages of rabbinic literature, and they argue constantly. What makes their arguments l'shem shamayim, or for the sake of heaven, seems to be their insistence not to debate with their egos, but rather literally for the sake of something larger than themselves. They are trying to understand something, and they are never afraid to admit when they're wrong and to learn something and to take responsibility. You may be somewhat familiar with the debates of Hillel and Shammai when it comes to the lighting of Hanukkah candles, or the best way to fulfill any number of the commandments. When they disagree, and they always disagree, the sages Hillel and Shammai are, even through the argument, teaching us something specific about Jewish law. After all, why would the rejected minority opinion even find its way into the book if it wasn't something valuable for some reason? The Jewish tradition places tremendous value, actually, on this idea of minority opinion, the rejected opinion. And we show every possible sign of respect to those whom the law rejects. Just as much respect as the sages who write the majority opinion, which then becomes law. As the Talmud states it, the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel constantly disagreed, and ultimately a divine voice emerged and declared both of these are the voice of the living God, and the Jewish law follows the sage Hillel. And why? Because they were agreeable and forbearing, teaching both their own statements and the statements of their opponents. In fact, they often taught Beit Shammai's opinions first. Jewish law is telling us that the manner in which we conduct ourselves is more important a lesson than in being right. Why was Hillel's position embraced as law while Shammai's was not? The text does not tell us that one was more pious or more righteous than the other. It certainly doesn't tell us that Hillel was deeper or more correct in his interpretation. In fact, the text goes out of its way to tell us that God spoke through both of these righteous schools of thought. Both were the words of the living God. Yet the law followed Hillel because of what we might refer today as derech eretz, manners. Rather than simply trying to come up with the right answer when debating Jewish law, we are meant to learn something from the debate itself. This is what it means to have a disagreement for the sake of heaven. So now, once again, we live through a time of growing dispute and polarization. The political discourse in our country is increasingly toxic, and instead of engaging in deeper exchange, disagreeable ideas are tarred and feathered. They're labeled as outside of the camp and intolerable. With our backs against the wall, it feels impossible for us to extend to the other side the benefit of the doubt, or to find any sense at all in the arguments coming from across that aisle. The idea of a politician working with those with whom he or she disagrees, it seems like a quaint idea of a bygone era. And nothing heralds more harm done to our democracy than this. It would be so much more convenient would the earth simply open its mouth and swallow the opposition whole. But how are we to know, actually, when an argument is for the sake of heaven? Because we can easily argue that if I feel right, then my philosophical ideal demands that I fight for my side. My righteous indignation is supported by the heavens. I've heard this argument many, many times. I represent the side of right and righteousness, and therefore heaven blesses all of my attacks, all of my thrusts and parries. There is a beautiful illustration of a machloket l'shem shamayim, a disagreement truly for the sake of heaven that is still in existence from about 100 years ago. I think of this text whenever trying to find my own inspiration to pursue something better. Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, Rav Kook to his many followers, was the Orthodox rabbi who first served the resoundingly secular pioneers, the Chalutzim, of the land of Israel. He believed in them, even though he vehemently disagreed with the form of secular Zionism that they espoused. Because he also vehemently disagreed with the old world Orthodox leadership in Jerusalem, who would have nothing to do with the Chalutzim, these pioneers, in creating a modern Jewish state. Rav Kook sent a letter to his brother explaining a recent ruling that he had made, and to explain the way he was preparing for what he knew would be an expected blowback from his Orthodox peers. And his letter reveals something surprisingly measured and profoundly relevant. He writes in 1910, Shmuel, my dear brother, my beloved brother, it behooves us to constantly expand our horizons and to give every person the benefit of the doubt, even to those on a distant and undecipherable path. We must never forget that in every battle waged in the war of ideas, once the initial agitation subsides, that light and shadow can be found on both sides of the argument. Indeed, by attunement to divine will, we know that all human action and ideas in the world, large and small, are set and arranged by the one who reads all generations to improve the world, to bring about progress, to increase light and stamp out darkness. And even as we battle in fervor for those issues that are closest to our heart, we must not give in to those emotions. Rather, we must always keep in mind that even those sentiments opposite to ours have a wide place in the world. And that, quote, the God who gives breath to all flesh, quoting from the book of Numbers, has made everything beautiful and in its time, quoting from Ecclesiastes. This perspective must never stop us from fighting for that which is sacred and true and dear to us. However, it can help us from falling into the net of small-mindedness and contempt. And he continues, may we instead be full of courage, serenity, and faith in the God who loves truth and who will not forsake his followers. I would be most pleased, he ends, If you use any opportunity which comes your way to exert your influence, quiet the spirits, and increase mutual respect in your circles, as is fitting for people of integrity and wisdom who know their own virtue and objective as clearly as daylight. Rav Kook does not question the motivations of his opponents, seeking to distinguish in any way between arguments for the sake of heaven and those which are not. Rather, he claims that all arguments can be for the sake of heaven, inasmuch as they eventually play a role in what he says improves the world and brings about progress, increases light and stamps out darkness. He calls upon his brother to rise up to the balcony, to rise above the fray, so to speak, instead of falling into the net of small-mindedness and contempt. To recall, even as we fight for our own opinions, that in some larger scheme of things, the opposite force is also playing out an important role in the world. Treat them as Shammai, Rav Kook might say, not as Korach. Instead of seeking to push our opponents down into the bowels of the earth, we have to learn how to hold two truths together at once. That we can fight for what we believe in without falling into relativism, and that we can believe in our own sense of justice even as we respect those on the other side of the debate. As Rav Kook reminds us, that is the only fitting way for someone who seeks to live a life of virtue and integrity. Shabbat Shalom.